Imagine this. Your heart is racing, your body is tense, and a simple sound or smell transports you back to a moment you never wanted to relive again. Trauma has a way of embedding itself deep within us, not just in our minds, but in our nervous system. If you've ever felt like you're stuck in survival mode, constantly anxious, overwhelmed, or numb, you're not alone. Trauma changes us, but healing is possible. Today, we're diving deep into how trauma impacts the nervous system, why it stays dysregulated, and most importantly, how can you reclaim control of your mind, body, and life. Welcome to Mindful Chatting, where we have real, honest conversations about mental health, healing, and personal growth. I'm Kristen, and I'm a mental health therapist, and in this episode, we're tackling a topic that affects so many, trauma and PTSD. But we're going beyond just definitions. We're breaking down how trauma rewires your nervous system, why your body reacts the way it does, and how you can start to heal from the inside out. And we're going to explore research-backed strategies, practical tools, and daily techniques that will help you regulate your nervous system again. We're going to work on shifting your mindset and building your resilience. Whether you're struggling with PTSD or supporting someone who is, or just really curious about how trauma affects the body, this episode is for you. So grab a comfort drink, get cozy, and let's get started. This podcast episode is really near and dear to my heart. Not only do I work with trauma victims in my own private practice, but I have a soft spot for trauma because trauma is in everyone's life, and we don't really understand how it impacts or resonates with our personal daily life on a day-to-day basis. And I want to educate you on that. I'm not saying that everybody has trauma or that everybody has PTSD, but I want to understand and help you understand how past things can impact your daily life. So when someone is faced with trauma or PTSD, it can feel like your world has been turned upside down. And the weight of that distressing memories, that anxiety and that emotional turmoil can be really overwhelming. But I want you to know that there is hope and there is healing. And I want you to use this episode as a guide to help explore some in-depth coping strategies, tools, and of course resources to help support you in your journey toward recovery and rebuilding your life. So let's dive deep into this. First, we have to understand trauma, PTSD, and the nervous system. So let's break down all the different types of trauma first. And it can take really many forms. There's 4 really kind of generic umbrellas of each trauma. You have physical trauma, and these are injuries, physical injuries from accidents, assaults, or medical conditions. And that's important to note because I don't think enough people consider how medical conditions or medical procedures or surgeries can impact our ability of our mindset about trauma. We think that it's all part of this medical procedure thing that we have to go through, but it does cause physical trauma on our body. We also have emotional and psychological trauma. So that could look like abuse, neglect, bullying, or even witnessing violence. And this is also something particular to note too, of if we're secondary to that trauma, but we're witnessing something happening, we can have emotional and psychological effects of that trauma, even though it wasn't necessarily directed at us. We can have a collective trauma. That can be war, natural disasters, pandemics, and systemic oppression. Pandemics is also something to note. We all just came out, and I still think recovering, from a huge pandemic that lasted a couple of years. And I don't think we're recognizing how much that trauma has impacted us as a collective, as a whole, across the whole world, not just our nation. And then we have developmental trauma, which is chronic stress, and it mostly can be in childhood, but it can start later in life. But this develops over instability, neglect, or abuse. This is what chronic or complex PTSD can look like for some people, where it's all these little tiny things that have built up over and over, and that constant chaos and that instability can really look what this looks like of this developmental trauma. Now, PTSD can develop when a traumatic event overwhelms the brain and its brain's ability to process what the heck just happened. So some symptoms could include reoccurring distressing memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbness, severe anxiety, and avoidance. And avoidance is a key here because we can have trauma happen, but one of the key factors to be diagnosed with PTSD is that avoidance factor. That avoidance is really super important. If we're constantly trying to avoid having that trauma happen again, or we have this perceived idea that the trauma is going to happen again, and we're trying to avoid it, that can be a big red flag to cue that maybe there's PTSD involved. Now, how does this impact of this trauma impact the nervous system? And trauma deeply impacts the autonomic nervous system in particular. And our autonomic system is responsible for the regulation of that fight-flight reflex. I want to make something very clear. Our normal nervous system is the fight-flight. Trauma responses is when the fight-flight no longer helps us survive, and we develop maladaptive coping strategies like freeze and fawn to manage the stress of the trauma. Freeze and fawn are not healthy coping strategies. Fight-flight is. Now, of course, fight-flight can also be turned into maladaptive strategies, and we can go into that a little bit more on maybe possibly a different episode. But freeze and fawn is not a normal response of the nervous system. That is when the nervous system is dysregulated. And that's where it leads to this chronic hyperarousal, this anxiety, this agitation. But there's also hypoarousal, which includes numbness and disassociation. So let's dive into more of this hyperarousal and the hypoarousal. So you have your sympathetic nervous system, and when it's overactivated, this is what causes this hypervigilance. And the hypervigilance can actually look like racing thoughts, increased your heart rate, and this exaggerated startle response. And then you have the hypoarousal, which is increased by this parasympathetic nervous system suppression. And so that leads to this emotional numbness, this shutdown, and these feelings of helplessness. And with trauma, we tend to see one over the other. We tend to dominate, but both of them can be activated. You can see this overactivation and also this suppression happen in the same individual. One of the things I do want to bring up is the vagus nerve dysfunction. So the vagus nerve is one of our longest nerves that runs throughout our entire body and really touches most of our organs. And this vagus nerve plays a crucial role in calming our body down. And when the vagus nerve is activated, it will calm the rest of the body down and helps kind of restore this balance. But in trauma, the vagus nerve has some dysfunction going on. And trauma can impair this, making it difficult to feel safe and connected, which is super interesting because we tend to distrust, we tend to think that the world is unsafe, and that's because of this vagus nerve dysfunction that's going on. I bring all of this up because healing from trauma involves regulating the nervous system. There is mindset shift, there is a cognitive restructuring, but healing really is about healing the body. It's about rewiring this nervous system that has really gone haywire. And so a lot of these strategies that I'm going to be talking about in this episode is about targeting your nervous system and working on this healing, and also creating this new self-regulation that has really been, disrupted by this trauma. Before we go into all of the strategies that I want to talk about, I do want to talk about resources. And these books and apps that I'm going to go over are super important because they help you understand trauma, PTSD, and also the nervous system component of this. So I've talked about this book a couple of times in other episodes, but The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk is one of those Bibles of trauma. He goes into so much depth about what's going on with the body, what's going on with the nervous system, and really the development and the uppercoming understanding of trauma. Because Bessel van der Kolk has been around for a long time, has been an MD for a long time, and he was really one of kind of the first ones to work with the VA and work with the nervous system and work with trauma. So I would definitely highly recommend this book if you're wanting to know the in-depths of trauma. If you're wanting to learn about the nervous system and how to regulate your body, Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma by Peter Levine is a great place to start. Peter Levine is very good about understanding this dysregulation in the body and the nervous system, and helps you kind of process how trauma is impacting the body. There's also another book called The Polyvagal Theory in Therapy by Deb Dana. And I think this book is really important because it touches on this vagus nerve dysfunction. And so this is another way of regulating the nervous system using the vagus nerve dysfunction that's going on within what's going on within trauma, and using it within therapy. So that's a great place to start if you're interested in doing vagus nerve dysfunction and learning about how that affects trauma. There's also some apps. So there's a PTSD coach, and this was developed by the VA for veterans, but it also can be used for civilians as well. There's MindDoc, which is a mental health tracking app, and there's also the National Center for PTSD that has a lot of resources and information about PTSD. I'm going to put a link in the show notes for all of these books and all of these apps and online resources if you want to know more. All right, let's get into the strategies. So the first strategy I really want to talk about is professional support. A trauma-informed therapist can really help guide you through some evidence-based treatments. And I'm just going to briefly go over some of the evidence-based treatments that have been helpful for trauma, and specifically PTSD. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, can help reframe those negative thought patterns that are developed by trauma. But this is only going to be cognitive supporting. It's also going to help how you understand your cognitions and your thoughts impact your ability to feel and your reactions and your actions. So CBT is a really good place to start. There's also eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. And this uses guided eye movements to process trauma. If you're interested in learning more about EMDR, I have a blog post about EMDR for trauma that I'll put a link in the show notes for. And I'm going to do an episode just on EMDR for trauma. But this is a good place about rewiring your nervous system and learning how to calm your nervous system down, while also reprocessing images, body sensations. It kind of goes through everything, and EMDR is kind of a holistic process when you're looking at trauma. There's somatic therapy, which really focuses on your body responses to trauma and also helps with nervous system regulation. Again, there's also polyvagal therapy, and it targets the vagus nerve specifically and helps promote that calm and connection. And there's also medication. So some individuals do benefit from medication such as SSRIs, but I would really encourage you following up with a psychiatrist if that's a method that you want to go. but these are really the top therapies that are really evidence-based to really help with trauma. So if you are looking for professional support, try to find a therapist that does these types of modalities to kind of help your body heal from trauma. If you're looking for a therapist and really struggling on where to go, I have an essential guide for how to find the right therapist. I have a blog post that talks about finding the right therapist. And also we have a podcast episode that's just about finding a therapist. And I'll put a link in the show notes for all of these things if you want to dive deeper into that. I cannot tell you how important it is to build a support system. If you have family and friends who understand trauma and understand your nervous system and understand PTSD, when you have these overreactions of your nervous system or hypoarousal that's going on, your family and friends can see those signs. They can help address a lot of these things that you might not be recognizing that's going on with you. And so having that kind of sort of supportive reflection within family and friends can be super helpful to have as part of your support system. But I recognize that not everybody is willing to dive in to trauma, but that doesn't mean that they're not supportive. But you can also join supportive groups. We have a work-life and balance support group on Facebook that talks about mental health, that talks about trauma. I really want you guys to think about what your social media is influencing and bringing into your space. So if you are following people that discuss trauma, that discuss mental health, that are making you actively reflect and be introspective on your mental health, that is going to keep you more aware, more engaged in your self-growth, and that's just going to help you ultimately down the road, even though it might feel very overwhelming right now. But really trying these things and getting the support that you need in whatever dynamic that looks like is going to be helpful. All right, let's talk about nervous system regulation techniques. So if you want to know more into these, I can put a link in the show notes for some of them, but I'm just going to briefly go over some of the nervous system regulation techniques that can be used in therapy. And if you're doing therapy with a therapist can help walk you through this, help use it that makes sense for you. But I'm just going to go briefly over it. So you can have some breath work. This doesn't always mean breathing techniques. This can look like diaphragmatic breathing and like alternate nostril breathing, and that can activate this parasympathetic nervous system and calm your nervous system down, because we're not breathing in the same capacity that you would. And so it kind of just teaches your body that when you start to breathe this way, it'll make you actually stop and think about breathing, which ultimately calms you down. Cold exposure, so like splashing cold water on your face or taking a cold shower can stimulate the vagus nerve. A more productive way of doing this is using like cold compresses or ice packs. You can put them on your chest or you can put them at the top of your forehead. If you hold these for at least 20 seconds on and off, this actually activates the vagus nerve, and that can help regulate and calm if you're having anxiety or a panic attack, but it really just stimulates the vagus nerve, which stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms your nervous system down. You can have tapping. Emotional freedom technique is like tapping certain trigger points on your body. And when you're tapping certain trigger points, it can help release stored trauma through like acupressure points. So if you want to know a little bit more about that, drop a comment in the comments if you want me to go into more about tapping. But you can also look at or Google tapping if you want to know a little bit more. There's also progressive muscle relaxation. And this is engaging different muscle groups and, constricting them and then releasing them. And this is supposed to reduce that physical tension and also, relax your anxiety. I tell people to do progressive muscle relaxation mostly at night to help calm your nervous system down to go to bed, especially if you have a lot of restlessness or you feel like your body can't get comfortable. Progressive muscle relaxation is really helpful. Humming and singing. So engaging your vocal cords actually activates the nervous system and promotes calmness. But I tell people you can't just lightly sing or hum. you kind of have to belt it out. So if you're in the car and you're having anxiety, this would be a great place to start, of like turning on your favorite song and like singing really loud or humming really loud to really engage your vocal cords, and that will activate your nervous system. I have a grounding skills handout that goes over a lot more nervous system regulations, and I will put a link in the show notes if you want to look into this and have kind of like a little cheat sheet for you. Mindfulness and grounding techniques are really helpful. There is a 5-4-3-2-1 method, and so you can identify 5 things you see, 4 things you touch, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing you taste. Again, this is to help distract you, help make your mind focus on something else, but also to re-engage your body. And this is really helpful in a hypoarousal state, but also in a hyper, because we'll tend to over-fixate or under-fixate on things, and we need to bring ourselves back to the reality. So I want you to think of like grounding skills as your ability to bring yourself back to the present. And so these types of skills are going to be more about re-engaging you, distracting you back to what's currently happening in front of you, instead of getting lost in your head or lost in a memory or lost in a flashback. Visualization is also really good. So imagining a safe, peaceful place to help rewire your brain's fear response. Visualization only works if you work on your senses. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. I have this really cool YouTube video that I found that I help people go into a calm, safe place, and it kind of is like a guided visualization that walks you through. I tell my clients to kind of pop headphones in and have this downloaded on their phone just in case they need it. There's also something called the container exercise, where you imagine a container and you put all of your fear, anger, anxiety, memories, and you shove them in a container and you lock it away. This is kind of supposed to give you a sense of empowerment back and control. There's also this YouTube video that kind of walks you and guides you through how to do this, and I'll put a link in the show notes for both of those things. There's also sensory grounding. Sensory grounding really works when you have big, and I found temperature to be the most effective, but when you have these big adjustments. So holding an ice cube, for example, would be one of those, or bringing really textured objects. Again, this is to help bring you back into that present moment and kind of distract you and bring you back. I also have a vagus nerve handout that I'll put in the show notes that kind of goes into more techniques on how to stimulate this vagus nerve with grounding techniques. The next strategy I want to talk about is safety planning, because we're going to have crisis moments and we need to have a plan and a structure in place, because they can feel very overwhelming and very intense. And also, a safety plan is really helpful for the people in the support system around you, because if you're having struggles, it's hard to direct and ask for what you need, and it's great when it's all written down for you. So if we create kind of this emergency contact list, so who can I call when I'm really struggling, or who can my support system reach out to if they need help? The list can be, identifying your triggers, how you help manage them. So again, this could be for you to reflect on if you're struggling and you don't know what to do. It's a lot easier to just go and follow something than to think of something. And again, your support system can help direct you as well. Sometimes safety planning can have like a kit or something that has a lot of these grounding objects to help you stay present, and just having it off to the side, something accessible that you can go to. And establishing a safe space in your home where when you go to it, people in your home understand to either leave you be or to check on you, so that there's this not overwhelming, it's not, it doesn't bring you into more hyperarousal or more hypoarousal. It's just a place for you to, reground and come back. I want to talk about this idea of post-traumatic growth, because I think we focus so much on how the trauma has impacted us that we don't think about rebuilding your life and enhancing that post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is basically our insights and what we've learned about ourselves because of the trauma. And we really talk about like changing our belief systems, because after trauma has happened, we will create these distorted beliefs about ourselves, the world, people. And so part of rebuilding your life is reframing not only what's going on now, but also reframing your story. And how can we shift from this idea of victimhood to empowerment? And that's really by identifying the strengths that you gained through your adversity. What have I gained? What have I learned about myself that I would not have been able to if I didn't go through this trauma? We also want to challenge a lot of these negative core beliefs. So we want to work on replacing these limiting ideas and really go into self-worth and resilience. And then we want to develop new habits, because as our nervous system is dysregulated, we will create routines and conditions that kind of actually support this idea that I can't handle what's about to happen. So if we develop new routines and new habits that promote that I have this, that I'm stable, that I have a sense of control, we're manifesting and also challenging again those limiting beliefs and rewiring our brain that I can handle something that's really difficult and challenging, instead of going back to this victimhood of I can't and I won't be able to. Because again, if we say something to ourselves, we will believe it. So we can choose what we say. We can say, I can't handle this, or we can say that I can. And it's about choosing what you want to grow in your head. I cannot tell you how many times clients have told me that they want to go back to the person they once were before the trauma. I'm sorry, you can't. And we have to set realistic goals about who we are, because the trauma has happened, and we have to acknowledge that we are no longer the same individual we once were, and we cannot go back to who we once were. We have to figure out who are we now, and that is part of your recovery. And so it's about breaking these goals of who am I now into small, manageable steps. So again, focusing on your daily routines, focusing on how do I create stability and predictability, and also setting some long-term goals for like work, relationships, hobbies. If you have struggles with setting goals, we have a New Year blog post and also podcast episode about how to break big, lofty goals into small, actionable things. And this could be a part of trauma. It doesn't always have to be work. It doesn't always have to be tangible things. It can be something that's going on inside you that you want to work towards. So I'll put a link in the show notes for both of those things if you're wanting to set realistic goals and working on reframing this mindset. I also want you to think about that because we've been through trauma, we are a different person. But trauma survivors actually have deeper empathy, have more purpose, and actually have a more appreciation for life than someone who hasn't been through trauma. So there is strength that can emerge from this overcoming of adversity, from overcoming our trauma. And so it's about embracing resilience and our growth. Where have we emerged? Where are we going? What have we gone through? And look at what I've done. And so it's about, again, shifting that mindset. Instead of looking at what happened to me, it's looking at who am I now and how am I different? And look at all the wonderful things that I can do, instead of letting something that's happened in my past dictate my future. If you're having trouble with coping with stress, we also have a blog post and a podcast episode that goes over all strategies when it comes to stress and resilience. Part of learning who you are now and understanding that you're no longer the same individual after the trauma is sometimes those activities that once brought you joy and fulfillment before the trauma may no longer do that for you now. And there's a lot of grief attached to that, because not only do we have to grieve the loss of who we once were, But we have to grieve the fact that this activity, this hobby, this thing is not fulfilling me anymore. And again, instead of dwelling on the loss and being angry at the trauma for taking that away, who are we now? And where can we find the joy and fulfillment now? And encouraging ourselves to branch out and to see who we are and where can we find joy? What can fulfill me? I always kind of suggest work going into like volunteering or some advocacy work in mental health or trauma recovery spaces, because it also helps with understanding that we're not alone. So it brings this isolation piece into it of we're not the only one that has experienced trauma, but maybe we need to be around people and see how far we've come and see how we can give back to that space. And then that can also help rediscover this meaning and purpose for our life now. The last thing I really want to harp on is this advocacy for yourself. Trauma is really hard to explain. And unless you have providers and people around you that are trauma informed, you're going to have to advocate for what you need. And so it's about setting and communicating clear boundaries with the people around you. It's also about educating yourself. So work might not be as accommodating. And so it's understanding your rights in the workplace and how you can get accommodations for your PTSD. It's also seeking out informed healthcare providers if you feel like people aren't listening to you. And it's also about finding education, sharing maybe this episode with people around you so that they can understand what you're going through and the trauma. And this is just basically a superficial piece about trauma, but sometimes we just need something. It's better than nothing. And if you want to share this episode, go ahead. But this is a part of advocating for yourself and setting what you need from the people around you. If you're looking for more resources, I have some more books. There's lots of books on trauma. There's Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. There's The Polyvagal Theory by Stephen Porridge. It Doesn't Start With You by Mark Woolen. That's on generational trauma. What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry. There's also some apps that can be very effective. I love Brain FM. Brain FM offers some guided meditations, but it also has induced focus and de-stress and chill modes that you can use. There's also Woebot, which is spelled WOEBOT. That's an AI-driven chatbot that is CBT based for mental health support. There's also some online communities and support groups. RAINN, RAINN, or Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network is one of them. NAMI, or NAMI, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, has some great support groups. And the Sid Rand Institute are also some resources for PTSD and trauma-informed care. Healing from trauma isn't about erasing your past. It's actually about reclaiming your future. We've talked about how trauma impacts your nervous system, why it keeps you in that survival mode, and how powerful tools like breathwork, mindfulness, somatic therapy, and grounding can really help rewire your brain and body for safety and healing. Remember, this is a journey and not a destination. There is no right way to heal, and it's okay to progress, and if progress feels slow to you. The fact that you're here, you're learning, and that you're taking steps toward understanding your own nervous system means you're already on the path of healing. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and let me know what topics you'd like to dive into next. You can find additional resources, book recommendations, and helpful tools for you in the show notes. But until next time, be kind to yourself, trust your healing process, and remember, you are not defined by what happened to you. You are defined by your strength, your resilience, and your ability to rise. This podcast may contain affiliate links, and if you click on these links and make a purchase, I may receive a small commission at no extra cost to you. I only recommend products and services that I personally use and believe will add value to you. Thank you for supporting the podcast.